All right, my name is Michael Williams. I'm a correspondent with the Capitol Forum, and I am very pleased to be joined by Greg Bingham, David Drabkin, and Richard Loeb, who, between them, not to age them, but there's probably a century of government contracting experience up here.
10, 10, and 80.
Yeah.
I'm old.
Yeah, so I think it should be a very good dynamic discussion, and I want to start it out posing a question to each of the panelists, and letting them have a 3-minute. We'll try to keep it under 5 at least. Opening remarks to answer that question, and the question I want to pose is the DOD OIG did a huge report on trans time. And they found that 99% of all contracts analyzed had excessive profits. Some of these profits were upwards of 4,700%. Now, as shocking as that was to me, one thing that was even more shocking was that there were no allegations that TransDigm had broken any contracting laws. And in the hearing in which they were brought before Congress, they were asked by a representative about a recent acquisition. They just bought Esterline, a huge parts manufacturer, and they were asked, will you promise not to raise prices on the government with this acquisition? And Kevin Stein, the CEO of the company, said, we will follow regulations to the letter of the law. He was asked again, and he said that again. He repeated it 4 times. It was almost like a monk chanting a mantra. And so the question I want to pose to the panel is, if we have these huge overcharges on almost every contract, yet no contracting laws are broken, are we really dealing with a bad actor in the system, or are we dealing with a broken system? So I would like each panelist to begin with some remarks on their take on that question. I think we can start with Greg.
And I'm going to stand up just because I'm kind of a hyper person, and standing is easier for me than sitting. And you said overcharges, and that has a technical meaning, and there were no, to my accounting knowledge, there were no overcharges here. And so just a little bit about my background. So 33 years of more or less more consulting than anything else. So I spend a lot of time with contractors. So I will give you to a certain extent the contractor's perspective on this. I'm also an adjunct professor at George Washington University, where I teach pricing and cost issues in government contracts. So I teach a lot of government contracting officers and contracting officer representatives and that sort of thing on the kind of subject that we're talking about here. And so there's several things that I think are kind of unremarkable in the procurements that we've talked about, or that have been the subject of the TransDigm investigation. That in the public debate they come across as remarkable, and that is things like providing cost information. Now, it is unremarkable for a contractor to refuse to give cost information to the government when they don't have to. That is much more typical than in some way unusual. And there are a lot of reasons why that's the case. And I'm sorry to have to bore you with a little bit of accounting speak for a few minutes, but to understand that. So let's say a commercial company that doesn't sell much to the government, the federal government, they get, if they're publicly traded, they get audited by financial accountants. And one of the big 4 accounting firms or some other accounting firm will audit them. They'll submit financial statements, income statement, balance sheet, statement of cash flow. Investors will rely on that type of information. Okay, in producing that information is very different than what the government is asking for when the government asks for cost. When the government asks for cost, the information, they're asking for FAR 31 cost information. That's Federal Acquisition Regulation Part 31. And it has very unique rules on how you pool and allocate indirect costs and how you account for direct costs. And it has approximately 50 categories of unallowable costs that a typical company will incur these costs, but the government has said, from a public policy perspective, we're not going to reimburse a contractor for this cost. Now that's fine for the federal government to say, But for a contractor to then tweak or like more or less overhaul its accounting system to keep track of these unallowables, to make sure that they're treated separately, that is a lot of work. And that's a big expense, and a company would be ill-advised to go to that expense if they don't have to. So when you give that kind of information to the federal government, there's a lot of risk from the contractor's perspective. Also note that the government auditors are not independent bodies. They work for the department, the DCAA, the Defense Contract Audit Agency is the typical auditor. They work for the Department of Defense. They issue reports to Congress every year expounding on how much cost they have disallowed. And it's part of their badge of honor, it's part of how they justify their budget, is how much cost they've disallowed over the last year. They're not independent, they're more of an arm of they are an arm of the government, they have a position. Commercial items is another area that's been talked about a lot here. And the definition of commercial item, and commercial item means also commercial service, so commercial item or commercial service. It's in FAR 2.101. It's been tweaked a lot over the years. It's a page and a half long now. It's very much debated. What is a commercial item? And it's not uncommon for parties, the buyer and the seller, to disagree about whether something is a commercial item. And there's even, I've seen a number of times in my career, where they get to the point of procurement and they have not agreed on that. So the contracting officer says, I do not agree it's a commercial item, but they apply the exemptions that go with a commercial item to the procurement. So when I see in the testimony in this case where TransDigm's saying a significant number of these are commercial items, and the IG is saying, well, the contracting officer didn't say that these were commercial, said these are not commercial items. Well, I see that practically speaking a fair amount, where and partly, I mean, that's an area where acquisition reform could benefit us greatly, because it's just a definition that both parties could agree on, as opposed to there being so much gray area in what constitutes a commercial item. Efficiency, speed and efficiency. Bill Wood, I was really appreciated your remarks, and when you talk about efficiency and simplification and competition, we want more. Competition is a good thing. More competition would be better. How do we get more competition? Well, we simplify things. We attract more businesses that will currently say, no way would I sell to the federal government and subject myself to all of the kind of scrutiny that we're talking about here. I mean, there's probably a lot of commercial entities that are saying, yeah, I was debating whether I should offer that for sale to the U.S. government, but now I think not. And you think about, in a free market economy, an entrepreneur, in a free market economy in general, the value of something is its price. And so you focus on price, not cost. Cost plus profit equals price. You get into cost analysis and figuring out what cost is. That's very complicated and time consuming. When you focus on price. And in a free market economy, you can compare the price of various goods and services. Entrepreneurs try to figure out ways to offer something that has a high value, a high price, that doesn't cost much. And when they do, they make a lot of profit. But people benefit, society benefits when you have these things that have high value that are provided. And we talked about market research a little bit. I'm almost done. Market research and determining what is a fair price. And you think about, you say you want to buy a car, say you want to buy a house, and so what will you do? You typically will look at comparables. So you'll look at what is a car like the car I want to buy, what is it being sold in different forums, and then you will decide on the price you're going to offer based on that. You won't go ask someone, what did it cost you to make this car? Okay, buying a house is the same thing. A house is a little more complicated, because you might look at, okay, what houses have been sold in this neighborhood in the last 5 years that are roughly the same size, roughly the same condition? Well, maybe there were none in that exact neighborhood in the last 5 years, so you have to expand it to a bigger neighborhood, or you have to expand it to houses that are, larger and smaller. But you do get to the point of comparables because that's how you can figure out what price you're going to offer. And you never, in this scenario, you never ask, what did it cost to build that house? How much has the house been maintained over the last 20 years? How much improvements have been made? You never ask that kind of thing. You're just focused on price. And that's the kind of marketplace that is efficient, and that it would be good for us to get closer to that type of marketplace. So, thank you.
Thanks, Ray. David?
Well, he says standard, so I'll stand up.
Well, you don't have to. I appreciate it. And being as tall as I am, I may have adjusted this.
Well, you are tall, but us old, short guys will somehow survive. Well, first of all, thanks very much. I was invited to address this forum 2 years ago, where I was surprised, some might say. Well, I was surprised because I was brought into the discussion of TransDigm. At the time, I was a commissioner on the 809 panel. Then I subsequently became the chairman of the 809 panel. And during the course of the panel's discussions on how to improve defense acquisition, we heard from both TransDigm and from those of you who don't like the TransDigm model. You may notice that in our report, which is 2,700 pages plus with 98 recommendations and a myriad of sub-recommendations, we did not specifically address the TransDigm situation. Instead, we focused our attention on the system. Let's begin with, why do we do acquisition? The purpose of acquisition, in the Department of Defense at least, is to deliver capability to the warfighter inside the turn of our near-peer competitors and non-state actors. That's the Russians, the Chinese, ISIS, and that fat kid who tries to read the SecDef's emails from his bedroom at night that the president refers to. That's the purpose of acquisition. And we support the National Defense Strategy. The last one was done by Secretary Mattis. And in that strategy, he pointed out how important it was for us to bring technology from non-traditional suppliers as well as traditional suppliers to our marketplace. Without it, we won't beat the Russians or Chinese, who have the ability, and by the way, during the course of our investigations and meetings, we were preceded in a couple of companies by Chinese delegations who had offered to buy the company lock, stock, and barrel, had offered to buy their IP, tried to get a seat on their board, wanted to buy anything they could do. We have to get ahead of those folks, and our system has to be able to do it. That system has to display the standards which we live by in acquisition. And those are competition, integrity, and transparency. But we need to have a different concept in the future of what competition means. Because really our system today is anti-competitive. The only people who get to submit a bid for the government to consider are the ones who figured out how to go through our myriad of rules and submit a proposal. There are literally hundreds of other companies who could do the same thing that never compete for the work the department sells. There is no privilege in selling to the department. We don't have royal warrants that we give to a company who is selling to us as part of their compensation. You know, now there's some exceptions, and you have to understand that we have this discussion. You need to distinguish price-type competitions from cost-type competitions. In a cost-type competition, we reduce the risk that any company has in selling to the government. And in that process, we've set up a table of profit margins which we think would be reasonable in return for the reduced risk we provide. That's the 15% rule that the DOD used in its report. But that's for cost-type contracts where the government is reducing the risk. When you're not having a cost-type contract, the risk of performance is on the company, not on the government. And we don't control their profit, despite the fact that the DOD invented a brand new term in its report. Search acquisition. There is no such term as excessive profits. Just doesn't exist. There are profits which exceed the table in the DFARS for cost-type contracts, where it recommends, by the way, it's not the absolute cap, that 15% is the max. And then it gives you factors for deciding what the profit should be. But in fixed-price contracts, no such application exists. And that's why in this discussion about TransDigm, it's really important to understand that despite the DODIG's assertions in its report, the TransDigm profits don't violate any rule. Now listen, I don't agree with people who gouge a buyer or people who profit over war. War profiteering is horrible, and it should not be allowed. But there's currently no statute and currently no regulations that tell a seller what profit they can charge the government. And in fact, although TransDigm's made the news, if you went and looked at what the sellers of ink cartridges make in terms of profit when they sell you an ink cartridge, or for that matter, go to the aftermarket brake pad market, or pick almost any other consumable item available in the marketplace to everybody, including the government, and you will find that they have profit margins that exceed 15%, and if they don't, they're not in business. So the real question in this process is, why did the government allow itself to get into a situation where there was a single supplier of a critical item it needed to support the warfighter? That's the question. And my colleagues wrote an article about it, and it was published in Defense News, one of my fellow commissioners and our general counsel. The government failed in its management of its sustainment responsibility of major systems. And in our report, for example, we point out that sustainment needs to be improved and that programs need to focus more attention on sustainment so that you don't wind up in a situation where you're slave to a supplier and have no control over what they charge you, or for that matter, how they spend money to improve the particular part you're buying. The government has that authority. It just hasn't used it. And Bill talked about the issue to take apart, break it down, and then to re-engineer it. The contracting officer who awards the contract, they don't control that. That's not part of their job. It's the program manager who wants the part who controls that. That's the person who makes the decision. The contracting process didn't fail here. That's not the problem. The problem is the government failed to plan for sustainment on these parts. And by the way, we're in for more of it because we have systems now that are growing older. And the OEMs of those systems are not producing them anymore. And when we go out to buy the replacement parts for those systems in the future, we may wind up in similar situations. You can decide from a moral perspective what the right profit margin is. I'm not going to concern myself with that. If I'm a buyer, I'm going to concern myself with what the price was, and that's the last point I'll make. Nowhere in the DODIG report was there any analysis of the price the government paid for those parts compared to the prices paid by the airlines who also bought the same exact parts. We did receive information during our investigations on the panel, investigations, discovery, research, whatever term you want to use, that TransDigm was actually charging the government less than it charged the airlines for many of those parts we bought. Now, in a commercial marketplace outside the concept of the royal warrant, if you get a price less than is being paid by other people in the marketplace, that's a pretty good deal. But you don't spend your time arguing over how much profit they made because that's irrelevant in the private sector marketplace. I'm sure we'll have more discussions, and I know my good friend Rich Loeb's going to get up and explain why I'm so wrong. But we've been doing that since, what, 1990, Rich?
I'm going to sit down. I want to thank Capitol Forum and Mike for inviting me. I consider this back since we did a conference call a few months ago. Partially going to sit down. I was planning on sitting down regardless, but after hearing this, I'm not sure I can stand up. And to be specific, actually, David, it's been 94 when the laws were significantly changed, but whatever.
Yeah, it was called FASA, Rich.
I know, right? Sure.
All right, break it up.
Let me congratulate my colleagues, and we have some agreement. We do have an agreement. I want to go back to Mike's point and his original question, which was, were any laws violated in the TransDigm case? And of course, I think we're all in agreement, all the panelists, we're all in agreement. Am I being heard? We're all in agreement that no laws were violated. TransDigm simply got caught up in a bad situation. So no laws were violated. So getting back to, I think, what was the second part of your question, the system, is the system broken? Well, I'm not going to say whether I think the system is broken. I'm going to, one of the nice things of having retired from the government after close to 37 years is I can now speak my mind completely as opposed to only about 90% when I was in the government.
You held back?
There was some holding back, but there was some. But, you know, the last 25 years, and I think I'm getting that right, 25 years, since David has just mentioned the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of 1994, which was the initial law that began the cascading effect, I guess I could call it, towards where we are now, was part of a reinventing government initiative of the Clinton administration. And it was very much a political thing, which I appreciate that my colleague at GAO can't really discuss the politics of these things. He mentioned going back 40 years, and I think I went back exactly 40 years, 1979. And it's interesting to watch how GAO and the entire acquisition system has changed. And change isn't necessarily bad, but what is rather striking to me is how the equation has changed. In the end, acquisition, procurement, contracting, whatever we want to call it, is about the buyer-seller relationship. That's what it's about. I mean, really, we like to make it sound very nice and fancy to ourselves, but it's really just an extension of industrial or commercial buying. That's all it's about. And, you know, buyers and sellers have common interests, obviously, or they wouldn't be dealing with one another, but they also have separate interests. And, you know, I don't think I need to say, well, the buyer's interest, of course, are buying low if possible, and the seller's interest is selling high. And I think what the last 25 years have particularly pointed out, and I won't get into all the political angles there, but the last 25 years have been about shifting the paradigm towards the seller. That is, creating an acquisition system where the buyer purchases the way the seller would like a buyer to purchase. And that has radically transformed the system into one where you know, the contracting personnel in the government have basically changed from being people who negotiated hard over price, which I think we go back to 1979 and long before that, contracting officers, contract specialists who supported them and others spent most of their time, probably the majority of their time, on pricing issues. And it wasn't just data per se and obtaining data, it was on negotiating over that data. And that's changed. If you talk to contracting officers and contract specialists today, there are still some who do it in some of the major system commands, but largely it's sort of, you know, type some numbers into a computer and get out. So I think the paradigm has changed. Now, I would actually say, and I've said this before, but not too often, that and I don't like the use of the word reform. I'll call them acquisition changes. Reform has a meaning from the late 19th century, that is to fix something that was corrupt. If you go and check your dictionaries, it's, there was civil service reform, there were all sorts of reform, there was good government reforms to correct what were perceived generally as corruption in various systems. So acquisition reform, I thought, was probably not exactly the correct term. There were certainly changes in acquisition laws and values, but not necessarily reform. It was just simply changes. But I would say that what has generally been called acquisition reform now for 25 years was sort of the government administration equivalent, and I put procurement and government administration, of repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. And I don't think that's misplacing it, that it was an attempt to really, really shift the leverage to the buyer. Now, mind you, I want to be clear about this. If I were representing contractors, I would just love what my colleagues have said. I would think those were really, really good things. And I congratulate my colleagues in the private sector, in some of the consulting firms, law firms, some of the accounting firms. They have done a magnificent job on behalf of their clients. They really have. I don't say that cynically. They've really done a great job. I think what's missing, unfortunately, is that in the public sphere, and I'm not going to blame civil servants because they carry out orders, is that there hasn't been a similar type of push by people who are supposed to represent the public interest. And I'm not, again, focusing exclusively, I'm not focusing on civil servants who have to follow whatever the laws are, but rather, members of Congress, their staff, and others. And, that's just sort of the nature of the whole thing. I want to finish up, I'm probably not taking as much time as some of my colleagues, but I don't know that I need to. I heard something about value-based pricing, and I agree with David, that, in the end, price is determined by the parties, mutually agreed to. There's no profit controls, at least not on fixed price contracts. At least they haven't been since the repeal of the Vinson-Trammell Act. But my concern is that the government is not pushing its suppliers to provide cost data. What is value? Well, I'm reading from Shea Assad, the recently departed Director of Defense Pricing. He says this in a letter he sent to the IG about their report, and this is hardly a left-leaning person. He was a president of a division of Raytheon. The so-called value-based pricing concepts are no more than an industrial code word for unfettered price gouging. Now, I've often said that there's nothing that prohibits the government from asking and even demanding, in some cases, although the contractor doesn't have to turn over the cost or pricing data, but if the government was a better negotiator, it would ask for the data and insist upon obtaining the data. Contractors could refuse to provide it. That's true. Or a contractor could provide it and say, my cost is $1, my proposed profit is $1 million. Take it or leave it. But that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because the government is not negotiating hard. It just simply isn't doing a good job. I will finish up on commercial items. There's no secret I was working in the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, as Bill Woods acknowledged, although I don't want to take credit for past performance. I was working there at the time. And as you know, this idea that we have not purchased commercial items in the government, I'll just say it's just not true. We've purchased commercial items in the government for many, basically probably since the beginning of the Republic. And GSA, where David used to be a very senior executive, has sold commercial goods and services for decades, long before acquisition reform. But the definition used to determine whether something was commercial was, I like to think, a fairly common sense definition. It basically required the contracting officer to determine use the term catalog, so it's a bit dated, or market prices of goods and services sold in substantial quantities to the general public. In other words, it used a market penetration test, as economists would call it. They'd say, these goods and services sold to the general public, yes or no. And if they're not sold to the general public and there's not established market prices that one could reasonably ascertain, which is pretty easy to do these days, then it's not a commercial item, and we're going to use a different procurement method. What what was done in FASA and subsequently in some of the other laws was to say, you know what, we're not going to use an economic analysis anymore. Forget economic analysis, which is what economists would use to determine if there's a commercial market. So I find a little bit striking. We're going to use a descriptive test, i.e. it's in the eye of the beholder. That's why what Bill mentioned, you have some contracting officers saying it's commercial, others say it's not commercial, it's of a type, it could be this, it could be that. You know, let's face facts. The purpose of that commercial item definition was really just two things. One, to avoid turning over cost data to the government, which just, you know, having a legal basis, I should say, of refusing to do it, a bigger legal basis, there was always a bit, and also protecting data rights. So I'll kind of end it on that point, but just to say that, you know, I think we've gotten way out of balance. I don't, and we can discuss some of this more.
Let the record reflect you took the longest, Rick.
Okay. Then
I wanna-
I apologize the greatest.
I want to maybe meld a couple of the themes you guys just got into. In particular, Greg and David, you seem to make analogs between a commercial marketplace and the DOD, saying, you know, in a commercial marketplace, we do not have any kind of pricing controls. Companies are successful when they can sell the product for the most amount of money they can get. The thing is, though, I mean, do you really think that the DOD is an analog to the commercial market? Its needs are wildly different from the needs of a commercial company. So to that point, can you really be making that analogy?
Sure, sure. The answer is, it depends. And it'll make sense to you why I say it depends. There are some things that DOD buy which are unique to the government and are made just for the government, and the government has the right to get data about those things and to negotiate based upon certain criteria. We don't argue about that. Defense unique is defense unique. But when the government is buying things that are sold to everybody, then the government doesn't have the right to control the market, particularly when the government isn't the biggest buyer of the particular item, good supply that's being sold. And there are lots of examples of that. Now, the government allowed itself to get into a situation. By the way, what TransDigm sells is TransDigm isn't the only seller of the things it sells, since TransDigm is the example. It's the only one that has certified parts, which is an additional requirement, which doesn't, by the way, change the nature for most part of the item they're selling, but it's the only one that has certified parts. Because when you put a part on an aircraft, it has to be certified. And by the way, DOD only accepts, in most cases, a DOD certification. The FAA certification that all companies have to get to sell to aircraft companies or to aircraft flyers, that is not good enough in many cases.
Can I push back on just that one point, though?
Sure.
The DOD flies thousands and thousands of commercially derivative aircraft. I mean, I hear the argument all the time. If it's safe enough to put your wife and your kids on a plane,
That's right.
isn't it good enough for the military? Why? I feel like if you lessen that threshold, I don't even think it's a threshold. I just think it's, if you got rid of that, if you want to talk about cutting regulation to get new entrants in the market, why not do that?
No one is arguing with you about that. Many of our colleagues looked at, who were experienced in the Air Force and the Navy in the building and buying of those aircraft, observed that FAA certification of parts was good enough. In fact, when I was here last time, someone sat next to me who made that part with a big bag of washers that he sold to the FAA certified aircraft but couldn't sell to DOD. And by the way, the DOD approved ones were like 10 times or 100 times more expensive. That's not an issue for the contracting folks. That's an issue for the program managers who make the requirements that drive us to a particular supplier. And by the way, they don't drive us to the supplier by name. They create requirements, and then they look to who in the marketplace can satisfy those requirements. That's a valid question, and people ought to be asking it. But at the same time, again, I point out that the government it's not a privilege to sell to the government. It really isn't. We got away from that in 1776. We were pissed off about that people were getting royal, and by the way, the royalty didn't pay the bill, they just said, you can put on your product you sold to us. It's not a privilege. Now, there may come a time, and by the way, we recommended on the panel that you put DOD's acquisition system on a war footing, that you change the dynamic so that we could meet the threat that's coming. We go on a war footing. If we recognize that we're fighting the wars that we're fighting, then maybe we ought to change the rules so that we control prices. But then again, where are we going to find suppliers who will meet our needs? I'll let
Yeah, and so I'll be brief.
I will.
Take as long as you want. I think it's, when you think about, isn't the government a different customer? Shouldn't they have more right to oversight? That's kind of the nexus of your question that I wanted to get at. And so I'd like to think in terms of spectrum sometimes. So one end of the spectrum is you buy from the commercial marketplace. The other end of the spectrum could be you have the Department of Defense. Employees of the Department of Defense build the F-35. So you don't deal with contractors at all. You all do it as a government agency. Okay. Another thing would be, like we used to do much more, cost reimbursement contracts. So you do a lot more cost reimbursement contracting where you just micromanage the contractor. So you know how much their costs are and you control their fee very well, but then you don't get the benefit. Well, some would say, I would say, you don't get the benefits of the commercial marketplace when you do cost reimbursement contracting. So you can certainly insist on much more oversight, but think about what you give up as you do that. Is what I think you give up a lot.
You're saying you give up people willing to sell to the DOD, even though it has a budget of over $700 billion.
There are companies already who are unwilling to sell to the DOD.
There are tens of thousands of companies who refuse to do business with the government in this country. Refuse. We interviewed, not tens of thousands, we interviewed hundreds of them who said, I will not do any business with the DOD. We interviewed the folks that provide capital, the joint venture capital folks, who said we advise our clients, the people we give money to, not to do business with the government, and specifically DOD. The second part of that is the companies that do business with us, they're good companies on the whole. They're innovative companies on the whole. But you all know that every day in the marketplace today, new things are being invented. And if we don't have the ability to get them, our adversaries will. You've got to have a plan. And what we lack in the department is a comprehensive plan for how we treat the marketplace, how we segment it, how we decide what things we buy and where we're going to buy them. But absolutely, Northrop Grumman is very innovative. So is Lockheed, so is Boeing. The best systems in the world were developed by those companies. We defeated communism through, seriously, we did, by the ability that we created a war machine that the Russians couldn't keep up with.
I would also say that we defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan with the Vincent Trammell Act as well.
Right,
I mean, if we have to set out on a war footing
And the communists.
At the time. We were on a war footing, we controlled manufacturing, we supervised the plants. It was a very different time. We've decided as a government not to do that. You can't have it both ways. Let's go on a war footing for DOD, for the acquisition system, until we get back to the point where the Chinese and the Russians aren't a threat. Gives us more control over the manufacturing processes, but it still won't solve the problem of how do we buy the really innovative, neat stuff that's being developed in somebody's garage today.
The acquisition cycle is very long. The DOD's acquisition cycle.
Since
To the
I'm
point-
outnumbered 2 to 1,
the
I
point of, let me just finish. To the point where sometimes something is essentially obsolete when it's fielded.
okay? When it was designed and the idea at inception, it was a great technology. 10 years later, when it actually gets to the field, it's not the latest and greatest anymore. We've got to shorten that acquisition cycle. I'd love to hear what Bill Wood would say about that, but anyway, go ahead.
I apparently am outnumbered 2-1, so I'll try to go somewhere between the two. Try to answer your original question, Mike. I have no problem, and I don't think any of us on this panel have a problem, when a government agency buys genuine commercial goods and services that are sold in substantial quantities in the marketplace, to use marketplace techniques to determine what a fair and reasonable price for those goods or services should be. And one of the really beautiful things of the information technology age we're in is that's relatively easy to do. In fact, really easy to do. But acquisition reform and all this commercial item stuff that you'll hear about is not about commercial items. It's about faux commercial items. Let's call it what they are. They're faux commercial items. Now, occasionally, I'm sure David and others can come up with real commercial items that the government is perhaps not purchasing in the most intelligent manner possible. But the government, by and large, purchases commercial items by using marketplace techniques and allowing the marketplace, of course, to set the price, and then they just purchase them at marketplace prices. What we're talking about, for the most part, and this is the reason they had to come up with a new definition of commercial item, which use of a type, which is always somewhat suspicious, are really what amount to unique government goods and services that, in fact, aren't really sold in the commercial marketplace. And I want to tell you that as a result of the TransDigm situation, there was a bipartisan attempt in the House by Representatives Ryan and Cole to change the definition of a commercial item. And it won't go through the whole thing, but it said it is amended by striking and inserting, it basically purchased in substantial quantities by the general public. The amendment was ruled out of order by the House Armed Services Committee, which is rather striking to me that it was ruled out of order, and the same thing where they ruled closing down OPM, an amendment to prohibit that is ruled in order. But I think that gives you some sense of the power of one side of the buyer-seller equation. I would also probably add to that I hear a lot about all these companies that won't do business with the government. All these companies. Mostly I hear about it from the large established government contractor trade associations and their allies, whether they be the Professional Services Council or the National Defense Industrial Association. They're always advocating for these companies that aren't doing business with the government. And I can't figure out why the established companies, some of which I agree with are fine companies, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and we can go down a whole list. There's unfortunately probably going to be fewer of them, but all these fine companies would be advocating for, through their trade associations and others, for companies that, who might be competitors eventually. So I find that to be somewhat counterintuitive, to put it mildly, that, if I had a lock on a system, I wouldn't argue for potential competition, and I think that probably underscores the fact that, look, we have a large system, we do millions of transactions a year, even millions, not millions, but hundreds of thousands of transactions of a fairly significant dollar amount. And we can always dig up. I once did this with an IG type. I was on the other side. He said I could dig up, 100 cases where the government didn't do it right. And I said, well, I can dig up, 10,000 cases where we did it right. So, using it sort of these stories of companies that won't do business, is what was it Secretary Rumsfeld said, there are things we don't know that we don't know.
Known unknowns and unknown knowns.
The unknown, right, whatever.
But let's correct a little bit of history. FASTA was passed in '94. When we implemented it in '95, the commercial definition included of a type. Mm-hmm. And it included of a type because at the time, the government didn't buy much services. The government principally bought products. In fact, in '94, if you look at the statistics, the amount of services we bought represented less than 10%. And when industry sells services, they never sell the same exact service to any single customer. They modify it to meet that customer's needs. And we were in the process of buying more services because of the Clinton administration and their decision to reduce the size of government. That's the first point. The second point is I spoke to the companies who are non-traditionals. And no less than Secretary Mattis identified the importance of reaching out to these non-traditionals so that those technologies that they were developing, we could have access to. And here's my example. Doesn't exist, so don't write it down. But somebody sits in his garage and invents a handheld laser that when pointed at the F-35 will knock it down. It is not out of the realm of possibility. And decides to sell it to us at 300,000% of what it cost him to make it. Are we going to buy it? Does he have a right to charge us that price because that's what he wants to sell it? Think about it. You decide.
Let me change the subject a little bit.
Perfect.
And this just gets to the idea of oversight.
I didn't talk about
if it's for national security.
I didn't talk about whether we wanted to buy the IP, and part of the problem we have is the government either bought the IP and didn't take delivery of it when it bought the IP, or we decided not to buy the IP because in 94, 95, during the same time, Rich was at OFPP, but he was not involved in this because he was on the CAS board, which he hasn't shared with you. He kind of ran the CAS board, who's focused on cost accounting system.
Makes me evil.
Yes, it's very evil. But we made decisions back then that now I've lost my.
I think this is a good time to open it up to questions because I think we've got a lot. If you and Richard want to continue this, you guys can find them in the alley behind the Hyatt.
I wanted to say, Richard, you ignorant slut. But I have the opportunity to
I want 90 seconds.
Okay, all right, we'll give Richard 90 seconds and then let's go to
You can
press
time-
for time.
You can time me on this one. I had the misfortune of agreeing to do a research project a couple of years ago where I had to go through the federal procurement data system, which really became operational in 1980-81. And I looked at, among other things, services versus products versus construction. And the fact of the matter is that in 1994, the percentage that were services was 40%. It is today 60%, but it was 40%. So, I mean, we can argue this, but anybody can go online and look at it. But the second point I would make is we're always told to look at the commercial sector, look at commercial purchasing. So I also had, I don't know if it was a fortune or misfortune, it was shocking, to examine Walmart's purchasing policies. I do this in my capacity at the University of Baltimore. So I looked at Walmart's purchasing policies. I mean, there's a relatively successful company. They not only drill down into cost data, they drill beyond cost data. What they will do is they will look at the supplier's cost, and then they will say, well, that may be your cost, and that may be your proposed profit. We still think it's too high. Now that leads to going to the cheapest places. The bottom line is the government is not purchasing. This is not about commercial buying. This is not about using best commercial practices. This is about, and I will continue to say it, it's about changing the balance of the equation between the buyer-seller relationship. That's what it's ultimately about.